Hello, and welcome to Autocracy Now. Today, for our episode on Stalin, we're going to be doing episode 9, Barbarossa. So, where we last left off with Stalin, we were talking about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the diplomatic negotiations that happened between the end of the Great Terror and the start of the Second World War. And we left off in a pretty terrifying situation. You'll remember, all the generals were panicking about who had to call Stalin and tell him that the invasion had begun. There are a few moments in the life of Stalin where things seemed a little dicey for his career. You think about the Siberian exile, when it wasn't clear that he'd ever be anything more than a revolutionary footnote in history. You think about the many dramatic resignations that he offered to Lenin, and when he had to deal with Lenin's last testament, which could have spelled the end of his political career if it had ever got out. You even think about the moment the Central Committee defied him and voted him as a more popular figure. Certainly Stalin viewed that as a challenge to his authority. But without a doubt, all of these things pale into insignificance. The first few days after the invasion were the closest Stalin came to losing his grip. The scale of the military disaster was huge, and such was the carnage and chaos around that it took a few days to be reported. Slow responses on the part of the Red Army proved disastrous. As many as 4,000 Soviet planes were destroyed on the ground due to bombing by the Luftwaffe. They didn't even have a chance to get into combat. And it meant that for the early months, the Luftwaffe had complete air superiority, which was crucial for some of the early battlefields that allowed them to bomb and strafe Soviet cities at will. A pilot, Heinz Nocker, recalled how easy the sorties were for the Luftwaffe. He said, quote, "On Russian territory, by contrast, everything appears to be asleep. The scene below is like an overturned ant heap as they scurry about in confusion. Stepsons of Stalin, in their underwear, flee for cover in the woods. Light flak guns appear. I set my sights on one of them and open up with machine guns in both cannons. And Ivan at the gun falls to the ground, still in underwear." End quote. Ivan, of course, is what the Germans called the average Russian soldier in the same way as during the war British soldiers were Tommies. Heinz Nocker, who told you that account, flew 6 bombing raids in the same day and didn't encounter a single enemy plane. The German generals had astonishing successes, encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops in the first few weeks of the war. Once your armies and divisions had been encircled, it usually spelled the end. You had no way of supplying them, they had no way of breaking out. This was the case way back when Hannibal beat the Romans at Cannae, and it was still the case in 1941. The Blitzkrieg was exacerbated by a flurry of confused orders from Stalin and HQ, who initially said to remain exactly in place. Any tactical retreat was synonymous with defeat. At first, this was just down to Stalin's disbelief that the invasion had even come to pass. But it played directly into the hands of the German generals and their preferred strategy. Terrified of retreat, but unable to deal with concentrated armour and tanks and the encirclement tactics of the Nazi forces, many divisions of the Red Army were quickly surrounded. If they'd been allowed to retreat, these encirclements probably wouldn't have been as bad. Within just 3 weeks, the Nazis took as many as 500,000 prisoners of war. With no supplies of ammunition, there was little surrounded troops could do, although this war is synonymous with heartbreaking reports of poorly equipped infantrymen sharing one rifle between them, running in human wave attacks fruitlessly at tanks. Whether this is at a wider scale as we think is unknown, but it may have happened once. Attempts to counterattack were often the worst. One instance from slightly later in the war, during the defence of Leningrad. Quote, "Altogether, over 135,000 Leningraders, factory workers as well as professors, had volunteered and been forced to volunteer. They had no training, no medical assistance, no uniforms, no transport, and no supply system. More than half had rifles, and yet they were still ordered counterattacks against panzer divisions. Most fled in terror of the tanks, against which they had no defence at all. This massive loss of life, perhaps some 70,000, was tragically futile, and it's far from certain that their sacrifice even delayed the Germans at all." End quote. Some troops certainly deserted in the early days, although it's very difficult to trust the accounts of Nazi soldiers, who obviously had their own motives for emphasising how quickly the Soviet soldiers were quitting their posts. For every German war diary that recalls mass surrenders and approaches being welcomed as liberators, there are others who remember fanatical and dogged resistance from the hopelessly outgunned Red Army. The attack had 3 main thrusts. In the north, towards Leningrad, that was St. Petersburg of course. In the centre, eventually headed for Moscow. and in the south they aimed to capture Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Russians. The Central Front completely collapsed. Andrei Yeremenko, who was there, described it like this. He said, quote, "Having covered every inch around with corpses, the Nazis broke through to Smolensk. Stubborn fighting for the town proper raged for almost a whole month. The city repeatedly passed from hand to hand. More than one German division found its last resting place in the approaches to Smolensk, and in the town itself. Every street and every house was contested by severe fighting, and they made very every yard of their advance. Hundreds of German soldiers and officers perished in the waters of the Dnieper River." Despite the resistance, the city of Smolensk was taken. Stalin, as ever, knew only one way to respond to bad news. He described the defeats as a monstrous crime, and he had the field marshal in charge, Pavlov, tried and shot for defeatism and conspiracy. Pavlov was almost surrounded by the German army when Soviet officials arrived to collect him, but he was hardly happy to see his friends. "Done for," was his correct assessment of the situation. He knew that Stalin would be unforgiving. In the early days, Stalin dispatched his most loyal cronies, men like Voroshilov, to the various fronts to try and get a handle on what was going on. By the time they arrived at their locations, though, the war had enveloped them. Places that had previously been forward commands were now battle front lines, and they had to rapidly return to Moscow. The most farcical of these incidents, of course, involved our good friend Marshal Kulik. You remember him, the one who thought that tanks were just a fad and that horses were the thing. Well, he was one of the officers that Stalin dispatched to the front in a desperate effort to try and get a handle on what was happening. Bombastic and bloodthirsty, his idea of good leadership was running around yelling "medal or jail" at his troops. The man, who was described as a murderous buffoon, showed his buffoonery when, in the early days of the war, he was nearly surrounded visiting front lines. He had to burn his uniform and escape in drag incognito on the back of a horse-drawn carriage. Within a week, the Nazis were 300 miles into Soviet territory. Things reached a breaking point with a bitter row between Stalin and Zhukov, where Stalin yelled, quote, "What sort of a chief of staff is it who since the first day of the war has had no command of his troops, represents nobody, commands nobody?" End quote. After this explosion, he sank into despair. Every single one of his assistants records some variation of this moment in their memoirs, as Stalin realised the full horror of the invasion, and murmured bitterly, "We fucked it up. Everything's lost, I give up. Lenin left us a great heritage, and we, his successors, have shitted it all up." The next day, he didn't come into work. He shut himself away from everyone, didn't answer the phone, and none of his underlings seemed to know where he was. For all they knew, he could have died in his sleep. And after establishing a system of power where such minute details were dictated by Stalin personally, a system where even taking your own initiative on matters was liable to get you shot, tried for treason, the absence of Stalin created an incredible panic and paralysis in the Soviet high command. The Vozhd, the leader, was gone. For maybe 2 or 3 days, at the place of the war, at the most critical moment, depending on who you believe, Stalin was cocooned in his house alone. What was he doing? What was he thinking? We won't ever know for sure. Historians portray this in all kinds of different ways. Did the man of steel have a genuine nervous breakdown? Was this some kind of alcoholic blackout that incapacitated him for a few days? Some of them like to go with Stalin, even now, playing a Machiavellian game with those around him. They argue that, with his authority challenged, he intentionally withdrew from power in the hope that he would be begged to return. In a sense, it mirrors the dramatic episodes when he'd offer his resignation to Lenin, only to be persuaded to stay. Such theatrics did often accompany Stalin when he felt challenged, and historians also like to note that this mirrors an episode from a historical Tsar who withdrew from power until his boyars begged him to return. His dominance was therefore reasserted. But personally, I think Stalin probably wasn't playing 5-dimensional chess at this point. You credit him with too much self-control to say that this was an intentional pause to test the loyalty of the people around him. It's the kind of thing he might do, but to me it seems far more likely, given how ridiculously unprepared he was for the war, that this was a genuine episode of nervous collapse. After being so disastrously wrong about the Nazi invasion, and with his armies so powerless to prevent their advance, Even someone as self-confident and driven by a sense of historical destiny, like Stalin, must have doubted himself and his ability to win the war. In a few weeks' time, they could reach Moscow. It could all be over. And surely part of him also recognised that his actions in purging the army and replacing competent soldiers with party politicians, as well as his failing orders to leave troops in place, were responsible in part for how easy the Nazis were finding it. It was this kind of incompetent personal leadership of the army that had toppled the Tsar in 1917, but Stalin's terror control was absolute. According to Montefiore, for these 3 days, he just wandered around his dacha, sleeplessly, hopelessly. And it's a compelling image for us because Stalin was a killer, a murderous, monstrous tyrant who reacted to any perceived weakness by reasserting his power, usually through violence. He was the eye of a terrible, historical storm, paralysed by stress and fear, wandering sleeplessly, as we all do when things go badly wrong, through his own personal hell. But this wasn't just Stalin's hell. This was Russia's hell. Eventually, members of his inner circle arrived to receive orders and to coax him out of his depression. There they found him slumped in an armchair, rambling about Lenin and the letters he'd received from the public describing the horrors of the Soviet defeat. Many of the Politburo members who saw him that day were convinced that Stalin thought they had come to arrest him. The paranoid insomniac, in a strange, doomed mood, asked, "Why have you come?" Beria and Molotov, two of Stalin's closest associates, and therefore those most capable of recognising his moods, personality flaws and whims, because these are the tactics you need to stay alive in King's Court, explained that they'd asked him, "Stalin, come back to work." Stalin demurred. He said, quote, "Think about it. Can I live up to the people's hopes anymore? Can I lead the country to final victory? There may be more deserving candidates." Now in this last sentence, you do start to see a glimpse of the Machiavellian Stalin, using this incident of his nervous breakdown to try and seek out oppositional factions with his own inner circle. But Molotov wasn't falling for it. He said, "If some idiot tried to turn me against you, I'd see him damned." And Beria, of course, the extraordinary sycophant, proposed a defence committee. "You, Comrade Stalin, you will be the head." Beria's slimy toadying concealed his secret fears. He was convinced after this moment that none of them who'd seen Stalin in this moment of personal crisis and weakness would be allowed to live. Beria's attitude towards Stalin is truly bizarre. He maintains this public posture of intense prostration before His Majesty, but in private he holds Stalin in contempt, and at his death he would hysterically denounce Stalin. He said, "Stalin didn't win the war, we won the war." But Beria would never have the courage to be anything other than lickspittle while Stalin was still alive. The next day, after this rare moment of vulnerability, Stalin returned to bombast, swearing that the cowards, deserters, panic-mongers and fascists would be crushed in a merciless struggle. But Russia had, 3 weeks into the war, lost 2 million men, nearly 4,000 tanks, and over 6,000 aircraft, a force practically as large as the German invading force, in a colossal series of defeats. The Nazis were jubilant. They had taken France in 6 weeks, and many believed they would take Moscow within the next few months. In the chaos, Lenin's body was secretly shipped eastwards away from the fighting. Moscow was already fearing the worst. Can you guess what Stalin's response to these setbacks was? For someone who was clearly devilishly intelligent, he really only ever seemed to have one solution to his problems: increase the levels of terror. "Soldiers should be more afraid of our side than of the Germans," Stalin would say in private. He issued an infamous order, not one step back, and personally wrote Order No. 270. Quote, "Anyone who surrenders should be regarded as a malicious deserter whose family is to be arrested as traitors to the motherland. Such deserters are to be shot on the spot. Those who are encircled should fight to the last. Those who prefer to surrender are to be destroyed by any available means, while their families are to be deprived of all assistance." End quote. Perhaps then, when we imagine poorly equipped Soviet soldiers who are out of ammunition just running at armoured tanks, the words of this order were echoing in their minds. they could save their families by dying as heroes. Not that Stalin didn't enforce this order consistently. In July, his own son Yakov, you remember the son he had via his first wife Ketavan, who died, was captured along with his artillery regiment. Stalin cursed his son for failing to commit suicide and die a noble death, but he had to carry out the order in the case of his own family. His son's wife was arrested in Gulag, and Stalin's granddaughter was left at the age of 3, with neither of her parents to look at her. It's a measure of Stalin's lack of personal attachment to people, and his fanatical devotion to the terror as a way of controlling people, that at no point did this personal tragedy make him think of the lives he was ruining with his draconian orders. When the Nazis approached Leningrad and Moscow, Stalin ordered Beria to hold some men back to man the machine guns. These blocked the entrances and exits to the city to prevent civilians from fleeing. Many of them would later be press-ganged into hopeless, ill-equipped resistance against the Nazis. Forcing them to stay in cities that were doomed only escalate brought on for no real military or strategic gain. After all, these civilians were now eating the food that the soldiers needed. As so often, though, in the history of the Union, ideological questions deem more important practicalities of human life. Stalin's voice, obeying them, was more important than the practicality of human life. Not that the people of Leningrad or Moscow ever got to make a decision. Just as the people of Poland had been, the ordinary citizens of Soviet Russia were caught between two ravenous wolves. Leningrad itself was one of the worst tragedies of the war. Zhdanov, who was fast becoming one of Stalin's favourites, organised defence in true revolutionary fashion from the Smolny Institute. That was, you'll remember, the aristocratic girls' school that had begun days after the October Revolution. Zhdanov himself, although as hard-working and fanatical as any other Bolshevik, was already showing signs of the alcoholism that would lead to his mature death. During one ferocious Luftwaffe bombardment, his nerves couldn't take it anymore, and he got smashed in the basement wine cellar. Even in the fanatical defence of Leningrad, Stalin saw wreckers and saboteurs. He said, "Leningrad will be lost through imbecilic folly. The commanders are busy looking for new lines of retreat. This is their only purpose. Don't you think someone's opening the road to the Germans?" Again, he just couldn't comprehend that the military defeat was down to their own inadequacy. It had to be saboteurs, it had to be wreckers. That's how paranoid he was as a man. Hysteria on Stalin's part was equalled by hysteria from Zhdanov, who orders his troops to burn to ashes the populated areas that they captured. A scorched earth policy, horrendous in human cost. Hitler, frustrated by the slow process of the advance, made the decision to surround Leningrad and try to starve it out, rather than going for a direct capture. This began the awful Siege of Leningrad, which would last for nearly 3 years. Stalin's blocking regiments, the men with machine guns ordered to fire on fleeing civilians, meant that 2 million people were trapped in the city with only intermittent supplies of food. Over the next year, half of them would die. There's a really tragic book that I read recently, which is The Diary of Lena Mukina, and she was an ordinary girl who was caught up in the Siege of Leningrad. And the diary, much like Anne Frank's diary, starts with ordinary concerns about her day and the schoolwork and the boys that she liked at school, and as soon as the siege starts, suddenly everything becomes about the war and eventually just about the struggle to find food. And you think it's amazing how quickly your life would descend into a struggle to survive if the city that you were in was no longer supplied. And in that we see her disillusionment with the system, which lied to them and told them that the war was going far better than it was on the radio. And we see as her loved ones die around her and she's powerless to stop it. And you just question how many people must have suffered like this because of the idiocy and the heartlessness of the refusal to allow tactical retreat. Apologists for the Russian communists, who still exist and mainly work on downplaying the impact of the Great Terror, they have to answer for that. They have to answer for this ridiculous order. The writer, Daniil Granin, who was there and who talked to the people of Leningrad, documented an incident where her mother's youngest daughter died. She fed the remains to her other daughter in the hope of saving at least one of her children. This is what happens on the ground when you issue fantastical orders as Stalin did. The Siege of Leningrad surely ranks as one of the worst hells humans have created on Earth. Stalin's personal orders didn't cease to wreak damage on the army in the initial days of the war. When Marshal Zhukov, the outstanding Soviet commander of the war, requested that Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, be strategically abandoned, Stalin angrily retorted, "How could you even think of giving Kiev to the enemy?" The wider grasp of strategy was lost amidst the symbolic importance of capital cities. Kiev was eventually taken by the Nazis, with the loss of 700,000 Soviet soldiers in the process. 5 whole armies were encircled trying to defend it. Marshal Timoshenko, another army man, had refused the order for a strategic retreat from Kiev, saying, "I don't want to put my head in the noose." Inevitably, in the attempt to appear strong, Stalin undermined his own war effort. By conflating any sort of tactical retreat with defeatism and treachery, from the highest levels all the way down, he ensured that the Red Army was terribly wasteful of its soldiers and resources in the days of defeat. Stalin would have done well to remember that the successful defence of Russia in Napoleon's 1812 invasion was mounted on a policy of retreat. The Russians had strategically abandoned Moscow and burnt it to the ground so that the French couldn't stay there. Of course, Stalin was probably thinking of 1812's scorched earth policy, when they'd retreated into the vastness of the Russian terrain and waited for the supply lines to become overstretched, when he ordered similar measures taken himself, with results that were terrible for both sides. As German forces approached Moscow, the hysteria within the city reached fever pitch. Stalin, despite the attempts of Beria and others to persuade him to evacuate the city, was determined to stay, amidst riots, chaos and food shortages. Some of the government were packed off to Samara in the east, along with Lenin's body. The Soviets went as far as planting landmines in their own buildings, in preparation for bitter, last-stand-style street fighting. And it should be remembered that that's how people expected to defend themselves against the Nazis. Even in Britain, when they were anticipating the invasion, Winston Churchill came up with a war slogan, "You can always take one with you." The idea being that if the Nazis came and fought in your house, then you were meant to sacrifice yourself in a noble last-ditch effort. I mean, it was total war that people were imagining. But even Stalin's pig-headed Bolshevik determination was beginning to crack under the strain. Montefiore reports a bizarre phone call where Stalin referred to himself in the third person. He said, quote, "Comrade Stalin's not a traitor. Comrade Stalin's an honourable man. His only mistake was that he trusted too much in cavalrymen." End quote. By this stage, Kulik, to whom he was probably referring, had been removed from important commands. Thank goodness. In these frantic days of October 1941, Stalin was forced to work in the Moscow metro to shelter from air raids. Neither his home in Moscow, nor the Kremlin building where the government ran from, was equipped with a bomb-proof bunker. So he worked in the underground. His staff slept on parked underground trains for a few hours a night, before resuming the flurry of orders to the front. 250,000 women and teenagers, with no training or proper equipment, were tasked with frantically digging anti-tank trenches outside the city. Dams near the city were blown up to create artificial floods that intensified the muddy conditions outside Moscow. The fact that dozens of villages were submerged by these artificial floods was neither here or there to Soviet high command. And in a way, it is in this defence of Moscow that the heroism of Stalin as a war hero is really born. The idea that he remained in the thick of the fray during the invasion of the city. But the city was never taken. The attack was slowed by Russia's muddy season in October and November. The Nazis inched towards the capital, but progress was agonisingly slow due to armoured vehicles sinking into the mud and constant, if wasteful, Soviet counterattacks. Stalin had clearly determined that this was the hill he was going to die on. When he was telephoned by a division commander asking for permission to retreat east, he asked, "Does your division have spades?" Confused, the commander replied that yes, they had spades. Stalin said, "Tell your comrades that they should take their spades and dig their own graves. We won't leave Moscow, and neither will you." In the midst of the struggle, the Soviet propaganda machine never stopped, with a Victory Day parade on 7th of November in Moscow, involving divisions of troops ceremonially marching to the front. There was singing and speeches. These reinforcements were more symbolic than anything, designed to raise morale in the city, and Stalin himself spoke for half an hour, as much as anything, to reassure people that he was still in the capital. German advance units were just 12 miles away. Yet there was something more auspicious for the Soviets in this parade than just a theatrical display of force. Stalin was concerned that the Luftwaffe would bomb the parade as an easy target, but a snowstorm prevented any of them from trying. Winter was coming. In late October and early November, two factors began to swing the battle for Moscow decisively in the favour of the Soviets. Stalin no longer had the luxury of not trusting his spies. The same spy, Richard Sorge, who he'd denounced for his information about Operation Barbarossa, now told him that the Japanese were planning to attack the US rather than Russia. As soon as he found out the news, a vast fleet of trains rolled from the east, transporting the Far Eastern Army to the Moscow front. Nearly 500,000 reinforcements and hundreds of planes and tanks were rushed to Moscow. At the same time, in the opposite direction, dismantled factories were being spirited eastwards behind the safety of the Ural Mountains, where they could be reassembled to continue producing war armaments. Soviet terror tactics and the ability to divert whole sections of the economy from agricultural concerns towards the production of arms meant that the USSR was outproducing Nazi Germany in terms of tanks and aircraft. If there was going to be a long war of attrition, the Soviets would win. Alongside this big wave of reinforcements from the east, the Russian general winter came to the aid of the country once again. Temperatures plunged to unusually low extremes, and, in many cases, the German forces were terribly equipped for the cold, stuffing their boots with newspaper due to a lack of proper clothing. The unusually cold winter of this year only heightened the death toll in cities like Leningrad that were surrounded. The winter caused over 100,000 cases of frostbite in the Nazi forces, and the German tanks had to be heated up for hours before they could even be moved. In some regions, ice made the use of motorised vehicles impossible, and for the first time in the war the Nazi war machines stalled. Hitler was furious, dismissed his commanders, and took a greater degree of personal control over the armies. And we've already described that there was a notable trend in the war. As the USSR started winning, Stalin relinquished personal control and delegated more to commanders like Marshal Zhukov, while Hitler took on more and more personal control. This probably both mirrored and reinforced the changing fortunes of war. I mean, these men may have thought they were military geniuses, but they were not. A counterattack with the fresh divisions from the east, some of them equipped with military-issue skis, swept the Germans back. The immediate danger to Moscow had been lifted, and the USSR had won their first victory of the war. Unfortunately, the immediate result of the Soviet victory was huge overconfidence and bombast on the part of Stalin. He ordered a wide-ranging counter-offensive across the entire line, a sort of counter-blitzkrieg, like he was hoping to sweep the Germans back in one swoop. Much like the 5-year plans, the targets that were set were completely unrealistic for the battered, bruised, and poorly equipped Red Army. But as early as January, Stalin was already planning his massive counter-offensive. Despite the crucial role that Marshal Zhukov had played in the defence of Moscow, and the glaring mistakes that Stalin had made before, he dismissed Zhukov's concerns. Beria was running around, relishing his role in making threats. "Do you care about seeing the sun rise and fall every day?" he'd say to people. A lack of coordination on the counter-offensive, and the fact that when positions were threatened the Red Army did not make tactical retreats, meant that these offensives were exploited by the Nazis. Whenever Soviet forces broke through, they could not consolidate their gains, and generally ended up being cut off in little pockets that were surrounded and destroyed. They weren't ready for a counterattack. Hitler anticipated where the main thrust of the Soviet counterattack would come, and cut it off at the pass, so these were just more men who were surrounded. Stalin was constantly overruling Stavka and military high command, and such was the nature of the terror that there were plenty of generals who could do nothing but sycophantically agree with whatever he told them to do. It's not clear whether he genuinely believed himself to be a military genius, as Hitler did in his later days, but this broad insistence on counterattack handed the initiative back to the Nazis in 1942. I suppose when you're surrounded by people who constantly tell you how wonderful you are, maybe some of it does start to go to your head, even if you know they're just it. Nor had Stalin's tendency to over-promote his favourites diminished. Meklis, who was nicknamed the Gloomy Demon, had been a loyal purger of the army for Stalin during the 1930s. But now he found himself way out of his depth, in charge of a vast counter-offensive in the Crimea. Once there, he was constantly disputing with the general who was in charge, causing confusion about who was really in control, as Meklis personally answered to Stalin only. The poet Simonov, who witnessed Meklis's command, described stupid tyranny and wildly arbitrary ways. Eventually, Stalin realised what was going on and delivered a withering telegram ordering Meklis to take personal responsibility for failures on the front, and he was removed from the Crimea. The worst of the counter-offensive was led by Khrushchev and Timoshenko around the Ukraine area, as Stalin called off the assault when they realised it was another German encirclement trap, but Stalin bristled that military orders must be obeyed. There's a story I've never been able to find a source for, but it's indicative of how High Command had been paralysed during this time. Red Army commanders ordering their men, who'd never even seen a river before, to cross the river without boats or barges. When the men tried to swim and drowned at gunpoint, the response was that the important thing is that the order has carried out. The terror paralysis exhibited by members of Army High Command make this kind of ludicrous situation believable in 1941 too. When the Ukraine counterattack failed, Timoshenko and Khrushchev blamed each other, both terrified of reprisals. In the end, Stalin's capriciousness didn't cost them their lives, but their failure in the Ukraine opened the way for his next great offensive. In the meantime, Stalin's own family was in disarray due to the war. Yakov had been captured and was in a prisoner of war camp. Vasily Stalin, who had become a drunk, arrogant man, still terrified of his father's shadow, was not allowed on active flights after Yakov was captured. Svetlana, now 15, had been evacuated to the east, where she still sent Stalin affectionate letters, questioning about the war. Why was it taking so long? Which suggests that the full truth of the horror at the front had been kept from her, as it had been kept from so many civilians. For Stalin, though, ultimately, it seemed that his personal life had been completely subsumed by his political life after Nadja died, and after his children began to leave home. The only person he ever consistently displayed love and affection for was Svetlana, but even this was about to be tested, in the time-honoured father-daughter dynamic, when she began to see men that he didn't approve of. The glamorous, intimate network of Bolshevik magnates that used to host glittering parties like the one where Nadja and Stalin had their final fatal row had been strangled off by the terror. Stalin's social life, such as it ever had existed, was completely limited to political allies. And of course, everything was dominated and consumed by the war effort in these years. The deeper into Stalin's reign we get, the more enigmatic and contradictory his proclamations become. All the memoirs of the people surrounding him at that time portray him as a guarded figure, oscillating between paranoid, sarcastic and jovial. But very rarely do you get the sense that you're dealing with a person, more of a living, mythical, historical figure. Even in drinking bouts with his associates, the barrier that his absolute power and willingness to kill old friends had placed around him was present, and Stalin made it felt all the more easily for his own ends. He had become an unreachable person. There's an account shortly after the war of Stalin drinking with Charles de Gaulle at one of the political summits. He proposed toasts to everyone in his entourage, his friends. "Here's Kaganovich, a toast to him, a brave man. He knows that if the trains do not run on time, we shall shoot him. Good Marshal Makov, let's drink to him. He knows that if he doesn't do his job properly, we'll hang him. That's the custom in our country." When his joke didn't go down especially well amongst the other allies, he said, "People call me a monster, but watch, I make a joke of it. Maybe I'm not so horrible after all." Wearing murder so lightly was a trait of Stalin's after the terror. He and everyone else knew that at the drop of a hat he could set the vast meat grinder in motion again. Such boasting in front of the Allies was a further display of his power. Everyone who attended these conferences noticed that all of the Russians watched Stalin keenly and reacted dramatically to a slight indication of his change of mood, like courtiers of a mad king. But his conclusion for not being so horrible after all was hardly supported when Novikov, the air marshal he joked about, was tortured by the NKVD. Gone now was the depression and guilt about terrible acts, if it had ever been present at all. Gone, too, was the ideological fervour, that all of this unpleasantness was worthwhile for the establishment of communism. Stalin viewed it as worthwhile for the continuation of Stalin. He would quite happily go from teasing you about the shape of your nose to joking about having you executed in the same jovial breath. Thank you for listening to Autocracy Now! You can email us at autocracynow@outlook.com. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. Please leave a rating and review on iTunes or your favourite podcatcher. That way I don't have to bribe Apple to force everyone to automatically download the podcast like Bono did with U2's last album. You can even donate to the show if you want to help us out. And please tell your friends, tell your enemies. Next time, the war will turn decisively in Stalin's favour, with the battle over the city that bore his name, and death will visit his family again. Until then, be kind to one another. Our theme music is The Spirit of Russian Love by Zinaida Trokai, and you can find her stuff at Kosta T, that's KOSTAT.bandcamp.com.